Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Tonight we are going to follow up to the group studies that we had last week and then group 3 had the week before. The reason we didn't do this last week is because I was supposed to be out of town, and so folks moved schedules, and I was going to do it tonight and then ended up not going out of town. So that's why we're kind of out of sequence even though I was here last week. So this quarter, really this year, the elders have asked that in our group studies, we focus on ideas of service and enabling service. And so this quarter's focus that you all should have talked about was related to attitudes of service. And so I think the first question I want to ask everyone is, when we say we have a goal of thinking about service or working on service this year, what does that mean? What's the actual goal that we want?
Well, there's many goals from that service, but the main is to grow and to strengthen the body.
All right, to grow and strengthen the body. I think you should have some class on servants that talks about that, Alan. No, I think that's a great point. And ideally, the reason we're studying about service is not because we want less service, right? Otherwise, we just wouldn't study about it, and slowly we'd atrophy and we wouldn't have any service. But instead, we're doing these studies and we're talking about, in this case, in this quarter, the idea of attitudes, because the elders fundamentally think that we should consider increasing our service. And so really, the first thing I want us to talk about, though, is when we say we want to increase our service, what does that mean? And you'll notice we're doing something a little different tonight. Crystal gave me feedback that we could not have a worksheet and give everybody 2 minutes and do like I usually do, and so I took her feedback as a strong recommendation. So inspired a little bit by Barry's whiteboard lessons, if you've ever seen him do that. We're going to do that, but I hate writing on a whiteboard and turning around, so I'm going to use my iPad. And we'll give some technology a chance for a minute. So that's some background on why we're not doing what I usually do. So when we say we want to increase service, what do we mean? Yeah, so help identify the strengths that you may have so that you can serve more. And so that idea would be similar to increasing individual service, meaning someone who serves now, we want to help them identify ways that they could serve in other ways. How else could this idea of increasing service, how could you interpret it? Yeah, so you have to humble yourself. And I think an idea in that is that we might need to broaden our idea of what service is. In our group study, I think it was Darlene who talked about, that someone in their past had come to another individual's home who was sick, dealing with a lot of people in the hospital, and had brought cleaning supplies and said, "I'm going to clean your house." Because that's the service that person knew how to offer. I would think of that in some ways as a lowly service. It's not an exciting service. Cleaning someone's toilets or doing their dishes is not flashy, but it is service. And when we think about that idea of humbling ourselves in service, I think we can also increase what we think of as service, or what we define as service. If the only thing that we think of as service is something that is hard for people, we're going to limit what we do. And an example of that would be a lot of the types of services that we encourage and that we train people for are public services, like leading an assembly or teaching or leading singing or some things like that. Those are very public things. Only some people can do them. Only some people want to do them. And so the more that we broaden the idea of what we all think of as service and are willing to accept as service, the more likely it is that we can increase service as a group. Crystal? Yeah, so broadening the definition of need is great because we're looking for more than just superficial things, or maybe more than just ways that we have seen people serve in the past. Great. Any other ideas about when we say we want to increase service? What are other things that we could be increasing in addition to folks who are serving now doing more types of service, or what we define as service?
Julie?
Maybe you know a way to serve, maybe someone else who doesn't.
Yeah, so in case you didn't hear, Julie said, if you're someone who serves a lot, so maybe you're in this group who's already doing individual service, you can identify other people who maybe don't serve as much, maybe because they don't know how to serve, they're still learning. And in that way, we can increase the number of people who are serving. Right? Ideally, we don't just get the people who are serving to serve more. That's good. We should do that. That's not a bad goal. But ideally, we would also, as we think about our attitudes in service, try to reflect attitudes that encourage and enable more people to serve than serve today. And Crystal already mentioned this one a little bit, this last one, and that is the way I've defined it. She said increasing what we think of as a need. I think of this as increasing those that we serve. I'm also going to put the need there. Because I think sometimes we can accidentally ignore some types of needs or some types of service and emphasize others, especially the more tangible a type of service is, the more public a type of service is. Often those are going to get more attention and more consideration as opposed to services that are less tangible and less public. An example to me of that is when we are providing for someone physically, for example, a meal when they've lost a loved one, a way to also care for that person is to think of ways that you can support them emotionally. And that emotional support can look like lots of things. It can look like sitting next to them quietly and holding their hand, right? But that is a service to that person in that time. And the more that we kind of broaden what we will consider as service, the more we can encourage those people that Julie mentioned that may not be serving now because they don't see a path towards serving in a way that fits their lifestyle or their habits, or maybe they're introvert versus extrovert. The more that we broaden those ideas of the needs and the people that we serve, the more opportunities we'll have. And as a result, the more we can serve. The idea of increasing service is not solely about some people who do some things doing some more things. Because that's a way to end up with a very small group of people doing a very specific set of things. And that's not our goal here. All right. So I want us to think about the fact that attitudes are powerful. And so attitudes have the ability that they can either encourage or enable service, or they can discourage and disable service. And that's going to get a green for encourage and enable. Sometimes the colors can be important, right? Encourage and enable, or attitudes can discourage and disable. When I say that, does that give anybody pause or create any questions about how attitudes can do that? No one raising hands. No one said anything, so we're going to say no. Great. We're going to talk a little bit about how that can be done. I want to talk about that from examples from Jesus' life. So this is where I want you guys to think a little bit. So as you think about interactions that Jesus had, either service potentially that he rendered or service that other people rendered, what stories come to mind from the Gospels?
Jesus washing the disciples' feet.
All right, Jesus washing the disciples' feet. What else? Shout it out if you got one. Well, all right, feeding the 5,000. What else?
Raising the widow's son from death.
All right, raising the widow's son. We might talk about that one. I'm not going to encourage anyone to try it. What else? All right, comforting Mary and Martha. Great. What else? Great. What others? The Samaritan woman. All right, what else? I think there's a couple big ones that no one's called out. Yeah. So healing, in my notes, I specifically thought about Christ healing the leper. The one that he reached out and touched. What else? Any others? Jesus taking care of his mother. Great. All right.
Him teaching in the synagogue.
I'm not going to use that one because I don't think that one's as applicable to service.
Okay.
I mean, it's good. That gets into teaching a little bit, so I don't want to go there. What? The cross. All right, the cross. Definitely not one we would normally think of as service exactly. What others?
Being a part of it when he talked to people that were spiritually blind. And I'm talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. When he's trying, he's getting his cause to get them to change.
I think that's going to fit into what Alan talked about in terms of teaching. I think if we go into teaching, that broadens kind of the discussion too much. But these have almost all focused, except for the Martha serving one, and the Samaritan widow, on service that Jesus did. Think of other examples where Jesus witnessed service.
Well, when she washed his feet.
Yeah. So washing Jesus' feet. Yes. I think there's at least one other. Well, that's the same story. Yep, Joshua?
When Simon the Pharisee had Jesus over for a meal.
Yep, that's the same story. It's great. I'm glad everyone likes it. That's a great one. So the friends, and I did not plan, or I would have had more space planned. The friends lowered the guy through the roof. The other one that I just want to reference that no one's called out, hey buddy, is when the widow gives her 2 mites, her 2 copper coins. That's a really important story to me when we think about the attitudes of service. So as we think about all of these, and you guys did a great job. I'm sorry that I didn't plan more space so you could read it better. When you think about all these different examples of Jesus serving, and we see in those lots of times that those watching Jesus' service sometimes are astounded by what he does. Not just that he healed someone or that he did something, but that he offered or rendered a certain service. And then similarly, in the examples where we see service from others, there's sometimes also kind of some wonder or astonishment about the service that other people are offering. And maybe that Jesus accepted it. Right? So if you think about stories here that talk about Jesus accepting the service, and people are surprised by that, which stories would you think about? Yeah, the woman washing Jesus' feet, I think, is the largest one, the greatest one, where the people were astounded that Jesus would associate with her at all, and they would have kicked her out. But instead, Jesus accepted that service. What other ones kind of show us Jesus being surprised, those with Jesus potentially being surprised or astonished at the acceptance of service? Danny? Zacchaeus? Right, because when Jesus went to his house, people were pretty concerned about that, right? Because, well, why would you associate with a tax collector or a sinner? So in the same way, when the woman washed his feet, they were astounded that Jesus would spend time or accept some sort of service from those people. Any other kind of examples of surprise that you see in this one up here, in these up here?
Feeding of 5,000, they were all surprised that Jesus did it.
Yeah, so in the feeding of 5,000, the people are astounded that Jesus did it, and as often happens, they misunderstood most of what happened there. Barry talked about that, last quarter a little bit, about them misunderstanding the service and then seeking more bread as opposed to seeking more Jesus. What else? Yeah, so when Jesus heals the leper, he touches the leper, which would have made Jesus unclean. And I think that's a great example of one to consider. Jesus didn't have to touch the leper to heal him, right? I mean, we have other examples of Jesus healing people he can't even see. So it's not like he's bound by space in some way. So he could have healed the leper just by saying, "Be healed." But instead, he reached out and touched the leper. To me, that speaks to the comments I was making earlier about potentially supporting not only someone's physical needs, healing, but also their emotional needs. Because you have to think about the fact that leper, for as long as they'd been a leper, no one had touched them. No one had touched them. Partly because we have 5 kids, but I can't imagine going a day, or really an hour, without someone touching me. And most of the time, that's positive, right? Not always with the little kids. But Jesus touched him, which was unnecessary to achieve the physical part of healing the man of his leprosy. Brian?
The apostles actually, when Jesus was talking to the Samaritan woman.
Yeah, so when Jesus is at the well, the Samaritan woman, with the Samaritan woman afterwards, the apostles were just flabbergasted that he would have spent any time with her whatsoever. But what does the example of the woman at the well show us about accepting service from a broader set of people? What happened because Jesus spoke to her and accepted service from that woman whose life was so filled with sin?
The whole town received the message.
A whole town received the gospel because Christ engaged with someone through an act of service and showing acceptance and love in that interaction. Barry?
I don't know if anyone else was surprised about it at his time. So
I've always been surprised, but obscure texts talked about these women throughout his ministry that constantly ministered and cared for him. And it's just almost off the cuff at the very end of his ministry, I think in Luke, he said there was all these women that were constantly caring for him and ministering to him and taking care, and just his needs. And before I read that years ago, I just thought, well, these men just were sloppy men, and they just, I don't know how they took care of themselves because they're just a bunch of men.
Right. So you can see that the women that are taking care of Jesus and the apostles in a negative light, or you can see it in a positive light. And I think part of what we should consider is, how did we have a couple examples of God feeding prophets in the Old Testament with birds bringing them food. He brought the Israelites manna. Like, it wasn't like the Son of God was going to go hungry if these women didn't serve him. Yet he accepted their service. What do we learn from the story about the widow giving the 2 copper coins?
Complete and total service.
Complete and total service. She gave everything. Everything she had. But when we think about that, there's Jesus' view of her service, but what's everyone else's view of her service? What'd you say, Alan?
It's just 2 pennies.
It's just 2 pennies. It doesn't even matter. What might some people then say about her service? Either it doesn't matter, or what would they do?
That's not enough.
Oh, so yeah, they might say it's not enough. It's not enough to matter. Or they might just discourage it. Don't give everything you have. Or it's so small that it doesn't even matter. So just keep it. You need that. And they would have discouraged the service. And so in doing that, they would have robbed the widow of service that she can provide, even though it's all she has. Yet Jesus doesn't encourage that. She wanted to serve in that way. And so Jesus' view on that is much different than those around him. And so when you think about that, how would you say that Jesus' attitude in all of these examples of service, whether it was his service or the service of others, how did his attitude enable or encourage service?
Approachable.
Say again, Wayne?
Approachable.
So when you say approachable, how does that enable? I can have the attitude of being approachable, but how does that enable or encourage service?
So many people act like they're above, and he did not. He was so humble. And when he would be approached by somebody that would be, other people would look on with disdain, he didn't turn them away. It was like the children that he said, let them come to me.
Yeah, so Jesus' approachability and his humility, in some cases, it enabled him to serve because he went to people who others wouldn't go to and he served them. But also, we have examples of his humility allowing others to serve him. That kind of ties with Barry's comment about the women. Jesus did not have to let those women serve him, I don't believe. He chose to allow them to serve. How else did Jesus' attitudes encourage or enable service? Micah?
Still along the same vein, but he treated others' service as the gift that it was.
Yeah, he treated other service as a gift. And the way I put that in my notes is that he honored and accepted service. And that was regardless of, you might say, size or impact. Meaning, Jesus didn't only let people serve who could serve better than he could. Well, no one would have served if that was the necessity, right? And so Jesus honoring and accepting the service of others encouraged them to serve more and trained them in how to serve. How else? Any other ways that Jesus' attitudes towards service encourage it or enable it? Julie?
His example showed others how.
Yes. So his example of broad types of service, some of which you might say were big. He fed 5,000 people. Some of which were small. He washed the disciples' feet. His example of that breadth of service being acceptable and encouraging enables other people to see ways that they can serve and that we should honor them when they do. Any others? Yeah, I love that. He was observant, and so he saw all around him opportunities for service. And some of those were unlikely scenarios where he could serve. Like the washing of the feet is an example. That's not a way that the teacher would normally look to serve. He identified something that others weren't doing, and he took it on himself, even though you might say it was outside his station, if that language makes sense to you. Alan?
And he also explained why he was doing it. Peter took it to the opposite extreme, and yet he took time to explain to you why he was doing it.
Yeah. So Peter, I can't go into Peter. There's too much. I don't have enough time. But yeah, Peter took the service the other way and was then like, "We'll do everything," and misunderstanding some parts of it. So I think it's important that when we think about attitudes in service, we consider that we often talk about the service. That's that ill-written rectangle in the middle, right? That's like the act of service. But on both sides of the service, there's attitudes of the giver and then also attitudes of the receiver. So how can attitudes enable or encourage service or discourage it on both the giver side and the receiver side? Let's talk about the left-hand side first. What are attitudes of the person giving the service that can enable them to give more service? All right, so the attitude where they are willing to take time out of the day. So sacrificing more than just money, for example. So they have a sacrificial mindset. Great. What other attitudes would enable the giver of service? Allison?
We see some examples from Jesus where he shows even when we don't have a lot to give, God is the provider of those things. And so I think recognizing that it's not necessarily in us that we're able to serve, but God will provide so we are able to.
Yeah, I love that. Recognizing that God enables the service. We've talked some on Sunday mornings about Ephesians 4. One concept throughout Ephesians is the usage of the term grace. And it deals with a lot more than just our salvation. The concept of grace frequently in Ephesians deals with how the Lord provides more than we could have imagined through his grace. And it's more than just salvatory. It enables us to do and to serve more than we would have thought possible. What else? What other attitudes can enable service or encourage it on the giver side? Danny?
On the giver side?
Yeah. Well, you can jump over to the right-hand side if you want.
Well, on the right-hand side, the receiver has to be willing to accept the help.
Right. So willing to accept the help. What does it look like when people aren't willing to accept the help? All right, so that's one way. They're critical. So they can just be critical. This service isn't good enough, or I don't need it, or I'd like it if it was a different shade of purple. Danny?
It's too much trouble is what I hear.
I don't want to be any trouble.
Yeah, I don't want to be in trouble. It's too much trouble. It's not worth it.
Yeah. What else? What other aspects of willing to accept help? Barry?
Switching back to the left side.
Brett?
Giving is strongly dependent upon our appreciation for being given what we've been given by God.
So it's dependent on what we've been given by God, and I would say that's dependent on a grateful heart. And I think that's more than just a statement about physical things. We approach giving differently if we think about, with gratitude, the hope that we have and what we're looking forward to. Chad?
Adding upon that, everything Jesus did was intentional. And we rise up in the morning, we're intentional about serving and thinking of others, not ourselves. The blessing is being more like Jesus.
Yeah, the service is intentional. I love that idea. I think, I'm going to embarrass Chad now. I think Chad's a good example of an intentional servant. The way he thinks about how he engages with basically every man in the congregation, as far as I know, or at least attempts to, that is an intentional plan. He has a calendar out weeks and months with plans for that sort of service and getting together with those men. That's the idea of, if you really want to serve, when someone says, "Oh, I'm busy next week, I can't," then you say, "Great, here's my calendar. When can I serve you?" And then you plan for that service. That's being intentional. That's a way of being intentional about service. Great. What else? Wayne?
As unto the Lord, or as unto God, is different from these, because you don't look at the receiver whether, oh, that is a king. You don't look at his status when you give. As unto God, I think is such a broad term that we don't put everything in that. Like, you don't think about how deserving the person is. You don't think about how deserving God is.
Right, you just render service. I think that concept of as unto God, that on the giver side of the page or the ledger here, a lot of judgment about how deserving a person is of service, I don't know that that's exceptionally necessary or helpful. In some circumstances, being judicious with how we serve is good, but spending a lot of time thinking about the ways that people could misuse your service. If I give so-and-so this money, who knows what they're going to do with it? Or something like that. Well, you can only do so much, man. Like, God told us to serve. What people do after you've served is not always your problem to solve. Your problem to solve is serving. So what are some more attitudes on the receiver side that can encourage and enable service?
Gratitude.
What'd you say? Gratitude, sorry. There was an echo or something. Gratitude. And so, Alan, when you say that, how does the gratitude over the receiver encourage and enable the service of the giver?
Because if you're grateful, they're going to want to do it more.
Yeah, if you're grateful, someone will be encouraged to serve in the future. And I think this is especially important when we are considering maybe small acts of service, I'll say, that may not even be necessary. So an example would be our boys feel like God gave cicadas to them as a great gift that they wish to share with all people. And so when the boys bring you a cicada, which they do a lot, rejecting that outright may not encourage them to give in the future. When we were at Granny White Park a couple weeks ago, Judah took Christy and Reagan's hands and walked them over to the trees as he began picking cicadas off for them, which Christy and Reagan were super excited for. But they took them. And because of that, in the future, I think Judah's going to give them other things besides cicadas. When we're on the receiver side, judging whether or not the service is something that we want, as opposed to desiring the heart of the servant, enables or disables service. Any other comments about that?
Sometimes as the giver, we are wanting to be a part of that other person's life. And this is a way for them to rush into your life without saying, oh, hey, will you be my friend?
Mm-hmm.
Which feels awkward, but it's a way to engage. And it may be the only way they can really engage.
Yeah, when people serve you, they are seeking to be in your life. And so you can welcome them into your life. And often when you need service, your life is really messy. And so it can be discouraging sometimes to you as the receiver to welcome someone into your messy home. Like literally messy, because your life is messy, because those two things often reflect one another, right? But by doing that, you may be in turn serving that individual who's the giver. If they're seeking relationship, and you can give that to them by bringing them into your life as they serve you, you've now enabled service and encouraged service both directions, because you've enabled yourself to serve them in their heart more deeply, that's the virtuous cycle, I would say, that we want to create. And a virtuous cycle is one that in a positive way leads to more and more good outcomes. When I encourage and enable you to serve, and then you serve me, and then that encourages me to serve, then I serve, and then we create this self-reinforcing loop of service that grows and grows and grows. Then we get more and more and more service. Or we can have the opposite. And when someone serves, we criticize their service, or we discourage their service, and so then they don't serve again. And so now one fewer person is providing service. And because they're one fewer person providing service, they're not encouraging someone else, and someone else isn't providing service now. And so now that's a spiral down as opposed to a virtuous cycle up. Barry?
That's exactly how Jesus got into the life of the woman at the well. He asked her for a drink. But being a part of that opened the whole door. He didn't say, hey, would you get out of the way while I get myself a drink?
Yeah. And Barry's talked about this a lot with engaging with people that live around us, that we can ask for service for those who live around. Hey, help me move this piece of furniture. Can you help me with my weed eater because you fix yours and I'm not good at that, or whatever. We can invite service. And similar to Teresa's point, when we purposefully invite service into our life, we're actually inviting people. We're inviting people into our life, and then we can share our life with them.
Certain people who aren't Christians, and their attitude is surprised by them because they're not treated like that. Because everybody knows they're conservatives. So they're doing things, about doing things that are unethical to people. And so when you deliver groceries, or you take some meals to someone, they will be sick, that they are surprised by that and let you know why you do that.
Yeah, so Crystal's point is around when we show the world service in our lives, they see it differently than we do. I think if you've grown up in a church setting, you really have no idea what it's like to not have a family like this. An example of that, one of our birth mothers in Arizona, when their family was struggling, we could not directly provide anything because that would break all kinds of adoption things. But we can call a friend who happens to be Crystal's aunt, who's sitting here, Kathy, who lives in Phoenix, and she reached out to people at the congregation where they are and took that family food and clothes, and I don't know everything they took. And it was absolute shock and surprise on the part of that family. They'd never had anyone give them anything, much less someone they didn't know show up in their driveway with care and concern for them that showed through in physical ways. We've talked a lot about Greta here. That was more than one time Greta asked us, like, I don't understand why you're doing this. What is in this for you? And when you say, I want to help you because that's what Christ showed me I should do, they're dumbfounded. It's an example of how service can show others God's love in ways that simply teaching won't always achieve. Because our lives are the example, and our lives do the teaching in those times in those ways. I had planned for us to talk about Romans 14 a little bit. We're going to skip that. I do want to just share a few examples of how attitudes can encourage or discourage service. So when Crystal and I moved here, we came from West End and Bowling Green. We had been married for 2.5 years or so. We got married while we were in college. And so in Bowling Green and West End, even though we hadn't been in college for 18 months or more, we were just a part of the college group. And for whatever reason, sometimes that meant that the college students seemed to have a little bit less expected of them in terms of work and service. That's a whole different conversation. The point here is, when we moved here, it was so interesting. The elders immediately started asking us to do things, and they engaged us completely differently. And because of that, we started doing significantly more than we were able to do at West End. That's because we weren't college students anymore, and they didn't treat us like it. They had expectations that were higher, and because of that, they asked us to serve more. When we have expectations that people won't serve, that expectation is an attitude. The way we approach them, well, they're not going to serve, so I'm not going to talk to them about service. I'm not going to bring opportunities to them. I'm not going to engage them in that way. And people will realize that either consciously or subconsciously, and they'll potentially serve less. And the opposite is true too. If we have greater expectations of one another, that everyone can serve, people generally will live up to expectations. Attitudes towards other service, simply believing that they can serve or will encourage them to serve more. This is a bit of a negative example. Limiting service. So once upon a time, Crystal got a phone call to take part in sharing some food with someone, and on that phone call, the person said, well, I want to make sure you're going to make something homemade. Because if you're not, that's not really how we like to take things to people. So are you going to? Crystal said yes and bought cream corn, and we took cream corn. We can debate if that's homemade or not, but it got rave reviews. Thankfully, her attitude was that she wasn't going to let that discourage her service. But sometimes people have a quality sort of expectation about service, and so they discourage or disable other people from serving because they filter what service they deem acceptable. And because of that, those people don't serve. And this is a negative one, but it's funny. So Crystal, one time I was out of town traveling, and it was raining cats and dogs. And Crystal pulls into the carport and lets the girls out. And Austin was of driving age. Austin Shearer was of driving age. And he offered to park Crystal's car for her, despite the fact that it was raining fierce. But Crystal, in her desire to not be too much trouble or to whatever, she said, no, don't do that. And so Austin was a 16 or 17-year-old guy who was seeking to provide service. It was okay with him if he got wet. He wanted to keep Crystal from having to get wet. But instead, she said no. And in that way, she robbed that service from him. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't going to change the world. But she took that opportunity to serve. And I think earlier when we were talking about how accepting the service of others can encourage or discourage, it can enable or disable, simply saying yes in that time when someone offers some service, you're perfectly mobile. I don't need your help. I can park my car. That was my plan. Or you can say, thank you. I really appreciate that. That was a kindness I had not planned on. And in that way, we can enable others to serve. I'll just close with our desire as we talk about service is that we increase service that individuals do, that we increase the people who are the people who are serving, and we also increase those that are served. If we achieve any or all of those, our quarterly study this time will be more than worth it. That as we as a group grow and learn how to serve and how to accept service, we can be known as a people that are servants. Thank you so much for your attention and your engagement. We're going to stand and sing the song that Evan's prepared now. Thank you so much.